Welcome to the History of the Papacy podcast, a podcast about the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Prepare yourself to step behind the ropes and leave the official tour of the story of the popes and Christianity. I'm your host, Steve Guerra, and I thank you for joining me on this journey. Gaza is a city of Palestine that is on the borders of Egypt, and it is of no small account, being a populous city and notable, but there flourished in and about the time of the madness of men after idols. Mark the Deacon, Life of Porphyrius, Bishop of Gaza, Chapter 4. This episode is a brief history on one aspect of the history of Christianity in the southern end of the Levant in Gaza. The story of Gaza during late antiquity is an interesting sidetrack to what we've been talking about in the series on the Decapolis. What started as a brief, quick 5-minute episode update for the Patreon bonus feed grew into a bit more than that, so I thought I'd put it in the main feed. This is a special kind of episode, but not in a particularly good way. I never really knew much about Christianity in Palestine, historically speaking. I read about and heard about some of the modern story of Christians in the upper part of the Levant, more in, say, Lebanon. I knew there were some Christians in Palestine and Israel, but I would say their story has been one I've never really read much about. That was until very recently and the latest strife in the Holy Land. And I really don't want to get into a discussion of modern day politics and global events. I have my opinions on such matters, and I'm sure you do too. One of the events of the current crisis that caught my attention was the bombing of a particular church in Gaza. Initially, there were reports that a Greek Orthodox church, St. Porphyrius Church, had been bombed. That initial bombing wound up being fake news, but then about a week later, it actually was bombed and damaged to some degree. To what degree, the fog of war is still very thick, so it's difficult to know the exact extent of the damage, at least of the time of this recording. Many people died, at least up as to the point of this recording, about 13. It could be more. Again, the fog of war, especially in this what some experts call fifth-generation warfare, is extremely thick. So we'll just leave it at that. And I'll leave you to research those events. But I was shocked at the antiquity of the church and the story behind Christianity in Gaza. So let's get into a quick overview of the history of Christianity in the area of Gaza. So a quick bit of background. Gaza's history goes way back into deep time, as far back as the 4th century BCE, and the city began as an Egyptian frontier fort. Move forward a little bit, the Philistines arrive, and that's a whole story in itself. The Philistines occupied what is essentially the Gaza Strip and a few towns to the north of the current Gaza Strip. They called it the Pentapolis of the Philistines, and Gaza was one of the main cities. You'll hear in the news about Ashkelon. That's actually in the modern day Israel side of the Gaza Strip, but it would have been a part of Philistia several thousand years ago. The Philistines of Gaza got a lot of coverage in the Old Testament, particularly in the book of Judges in the Samson chapter. Samson wrecked their temple and killed tons of Philistine Gazans in the process. Gaza then became incorporated into the northern kingdom of Israel, and it gets some mentions in the minor prophet book of Amos. And it's mentioned all around. The Philistines and their area get all sorts of attention in the Old Testament. That's just a very brief overview. Fast forward a little bit more. In the time of the conquests of Alexander the Great, the area of Gaza became the borderland between the Ptolemy Empire of predominantly Egypt and then the Seleucid Empire, which was more or less the Persian Empire. It stretched into Anatolia, it went into Persia, and then was a big chunk of what we would call the Middle East. Now we're starting to get closer to the time we're interested in today. The Romans conquered the area, and during various Jewish revolts that we've talked about many times on this podcast, and we'll be talking about more with our dear friend Gary Stevens of the History in the Bible podcast, these Jewish revolts completely devastated the area of Gaza, and a large part of its population was removed, especially of its Jewish population. The area in and around Gaza became very, very Romanized. And this is about the time we get into Porphyry, also known as Porphyrius or Porphyrios of Gaza. And we're going to discuss him in just a minute or two. So a quick fact to set the stage. Gaza was still heavily pagan, even in this time period that we're really going to focus in today around the early 400s. That would have been unusual in this area of the empire at this point in time. Also, this area became very Chalcedonian in flavor, or Diophysite, as opposed to Monophysite, which was a bit unusual as well. I think both being a pagan holdout as well as a Chalcedonian holdout later could be a result of this high level of Romanization in this area, very culturally Greco-Roman as opposed to Egyptian or Middle Eastern in flavor. And what this really means is there's much less of a Second Temple Jewish influence on the people. They're not as Jewish in this area because the Jews had been deported in large part or killed in all of these revolts. And so they just wouldn't have had that language. They wouldn't have language, meaning the language, Aramaic, but also they wouldn't have spoke the cultural language and the religious language. They would have been exposed to a version of Second Temple Jewish Christianity that would have looked different than what people in other areas that were more Second Temple Jew would have been exposed to, or more Middle Eastern. They just weren't in that cultural milieu. Then it also means later that there were a lot more Greeks and a lot more Romans in the area whose connection was to Constantinople and to the empire as opposed to a local identity. So I think both of those aspects really play into this story of why the Gazans of the late antiquity were different than what was going on around. And that's a little bit of speculation on my part based on the evidence that I've read and researched. As time went by, the Roman Empire transitioned into the Eastern Roman Empire, and they lasted a few centuries in this area. Followers of Mohammed hit the scene. Gaza was very close to the Islamic homeland. Gaza was the first city, like real city, outside of the Arabian Peninsula that the armies of Islam conquered. In and around this area of Gaza, there would have been a lot of Arabs. I mean, just the city was very Romanized, but the area around it would have had a very high amount of Arab influence, but particularly the Ghassanid Arabs, who were Christian, but then were very easily folded into the Arab of the South. And that's a whole different story for a different day. But we've discussed it before, and we'll likely discuss it again because I find them very interesting, but different topic, different day. Steve here. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, featuring great shows like James Early's Key Battles of American History podcast and many other great shows. Go over to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. And here is a quick word from our sponsors. I can honestly see why this area of Gaza in the southern Levant would be such a focal point in conflict. It is the sea and land gateway to get you from the Fertile Crescent to Egypt. This coastal route is really great for trade and communications, and there's a sea route that goes through there as well. Trade routes run through this area for that reason. It is that bridge to get you from wealthy Mesopotamia, wealthy Upper Levant, into wealthy Egypt. It's also beautiful. There is evidence of people, even during ancient times, going to hang out on the beach. This area had incredible beaches. Also, how can you beat the views? Really, honestly, if you look at the videos or pictures of any of the Levantine coast from Turkey all the way down to Egypt, holy smokes, there's a reason why people wanted to live in this area. In this short format that we're running with today, I want to spend the rest of our time together talking about the foundation of Christianity in Gaza. We can take a look at later times, such as the Crusader era, or even Christians in modern Israel and Palestinian territories in later episodes. So let's talk about Palestine in Roman times. Palestine was always a raucous area for any empire who wanted to run the show. The Romans put down a number of Jewish revolts, as we said, and the provinces of this area were constantly being reorganized and shuffled around, oftentimes to split them up to take care of all this conflict. But Gaza was always detached to the Palestinian provinces in the Levant, as opposed to Roman Egypt, which they weren't connected to. Time went by, Christianity considerably grew in the Middle East. And this is before and after Christianity became legal. It grew very rapidly in this fertile ground where most people were influenced by Second Temple Judaism. They knew it. They saw this new version come around in Christianity, and a lot of people liked what they were hearing from it. Christianity was appealing to many Second Temple Jews, many Samaritans, Greeks, and Arabs alike. There were obviously holdouts as well. A lot of Second Temple Jews didn't become Christians. Many Greeks and Romans continued with their traditional pagan beliefs. Gaza, being an important crossroads and the front porch of the Judean desert, grew and drew in many Christians. But it was really the desert around Gaza that became popular, and especially for the up-and-coming monastic movement. And this is where St. Porphyrius comes to the foreground. He's really considered the founder, or at least real establisher, of the Christian church in Gaza. Most of what we know about the life of St. Porphyrius comes from his contemporary biographer, Mark the Deacon. Mark's book was called The Life of Porphyrius, Bishop of Gaza. That's what I like, a clear and to-the-point title. Up until the 1800s, the only extant version of Mark the Deacon's Life of Porphyrius was in Latin. Later on, in the 1800s, a Greek version was found, and then a Georgian language version was found. And there's evidence that the Georgian version was based on a Syriac version that's been lost to time. So a little textual history for you. Getting back to Porphyrius, Porphyrius was born in Thessalonica in northern Greece around 346 or 347 AD. That was an interesting time in the church and church-state relations. Christianity had been legal since the Edict of Milan in 313. Christianity was the state religion of a sort, but just for context, Julian the Apostate wouldn't hit the scene and become emperor until 361. So, if you want to look at it through the lens of St. Porphyrius when he's a late teen, and that kind of shows you what's going on with Christianity. Christianity had a strong influence, but was still defending the ramparts in the empire against paganism, as it would for quite some time. Porphyrius came from a family of some wealth, so he got a good education. When he was around 25, in or about the year 371, Porphyrius began his monastic career. In his career, he went around the areas of both Egypt and Judea, so two big hotbeds of early monasticism. He likely met and worked with some of the heavy hitters of the monastic movement, such as Saint Macarius the Great and Jerome of the Vulgate. Porphyrius had many spiritual and miraculous events happen to him, including a miraculous healing of a certain infirmity that he had on his legs in front of the true cross. And he became a defender of the true cross after that. When Porphyrius was 45, he was ordained a priest, and then about 4 years later was offered a unique but challenging career opportunity. That gets us into Porphyrius in a troubled land. When the bishop of Gaza died in about 395, a major opportunity came around for the church. Now, this guy's a bishop. We think of a bishop as like a big deal. The bishop of Gaza, pre-Porphyrius, was the leader of a very small community of maybe just a handful of churches at that point. Definitely not a major bishop. He was really the leader of a town, like in the most classic sense. There may have been a couple of Jesus clubs around town, and that bishop of Gaza was the leader of that small handful of community, of people in the community. But Gaza was a city that was still pagan. It was run by pagans and for pagans. There may have only been as few as 3 churches, which is surprising, at least to me, but shows how even though the tide was swinging in the favor of the Christians, paganism was still strong in many areas. In a place like the Middle East, in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, the city-state was really king. Ancient cities like Gaza were fiercely independent, just like we saw with those Decapolis cities. They were especially independent in the area of doling out money for monumental architecture for things like churches, or allowing places like churches to even open. Rome, or in this case Constantinople, had to be careful with how much pressure was put on these cities. So like the Decapolis was in a league, but it was really the city-state that ran its affairs. Gaza was a part of a Roman province, but it had a great deal of independence to do its own thing, especially within its internal politics. Anyway, the people of Gaza went to the Metropolitan of Caesarea for a replacement bishop. This is an interesting little factoid because it shows the Metropolitan Bishop of the secular capital city, Caesarea, was making appointments like bishop and not the local patriarch, which the patriarch of that region was really the patriarch of Jerusalem. The bishop of Jerusalem wouldn't be raised to patriarchal level on par with, say, Roman Antioch and Alexandria until the Council of Chalcedon in 451. The Metropolitan of Caesarea appointed a successful and well-regarded monk priest, Porphyrius, as bishop to get Gaza in shape. Oh, can I get your attention for just a second? A great way to support the History of the Papacy podcast is by joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/History of the Papacy. Your support on Patreon goes a long way to help keep the History of the Papacy sustainable for a long time in the future. There are 4 tiers of support on Patreon: Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Rome. Each of these tiers represents one of the traditional patriarchates of early Christianity. There are many great benefits for supporting the show on Patreon. The most important, though, is being included on the history of the papacy diptychs. In traditional Christianity, the diptychs are the list of bishops commemorated in their order of precedence. The sooner you sign up on Patreon, the higher you will be on the lists of the history of the papacy patrons. By all accounts, Porphyrius did. He gained a great many converts. There are many miraculous stories, but also really interesting administrative stories involving the biggest names in Christianity. In one story, all of this from the biography by Mark the Deacon, contemporary biography that is, Porphyrius and the Metropolitan of Caesarea went to Constantinople to discuss the situation of pagans lording it over Christians in Gaza. They met with none other than John Chrysostom. The bishops, then all three of them, went to meet with the pregnant Eastern Roman Empress Eudoxia, still connected to Western Rome at this point, but divided between East and West, maybe not yet Byzantine Empire. But anyways, they asked Eudoxia if she could help with the situation of Christians in Gaza. And if she did do this help, she would have a bouncing baby boy. And more importantly, she would have an heir for herself and the Emperor Arcadius. Guess what? She did have a boy, Theodosius II, and she did help establish Christianity in Gaza. Finally, the Roman imperial authorities did come down on the pagans. They removed people from high offices. They changed tax benefits and did other shifts in power and authority in the city. The Christians were on top now and started to build figuratively and literally. Now, all of this is recorded by this follower and big fan of Porphyrius, Mark the Deacon, and it's a hagiography and not strictly history. Most scholars say Mark's writing style is very well done, and I think even if you're not a big fan of miracles and that side of the Christian story, you can see there's definitely some highly believable and likely stories all throughout the narrative. The story told by Mark makes sense and fits into the larger story of the history of the Roman Empire. If you want to read Mark's biography of Porphyrius yourself, it's very easily, you can find it in many different sources. I always go back to Fordham University's source book, which has sources from all over the timeline in many different ages. There's Islamic sources, tons of Christian sources, early antiquity, medieval, late medieval. So I will put a link in the show notes for that. Really leaving off today, the age of paganism was fading out, especially in the East. At this time, great churches are being built. A church is mentioned by Mark the Deacon being built in the honor of Eudoxia. This could be the modern church of St. Porphyrius in Gaza to this very day. The modern church, which was damaged in October of 2023 by a bomb or a missile, has a long and fascinating history. It was established as a church. It was a mosque for a time, and then had a major upgrade and refurbishment during Crusader times. It also had refurbishments and renovations over the course of the past few centuries, but has remained a church pretty much since Crusader times. There's very little to see, at least on the surface of the antiquity church. But when archaeologists and people in the know dig a little bit further, they can see the evidence of the ancient church. Another ancient church in Gaza was dedicated to St. John the Baptist, and that one was built in the late 300s, early 400s. It is said that this church was built over the temple of Dagon, and that's the very same temple toppled by Samson. That church to St. John the Baptist was later turned into the Grand Mosque of Gaza and is still standing to this day. We'll wrap up this short story for today. I hope it has given you some background and context for these really tragic events. Send your prayers and thoughts and good vibes or whatever positivity you can over to the Middle East. They definitely need it right now. I hope you enjoyed this little piece of history. I thank you for listening, and I will talk to you next time. Before we go, let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the history of the Papacy diptychs. We have, at the Alexandria level, Roberto, William B., Brian, Christina, Alex, Augustus, Judy, and Max. At the Constantinople level, we have Dapo, Paul, Justin, Lana, John, Steve, and Sean, who are all magnificent and reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome. We have Peter the Great, Amma the Great, Geoffrey the Great, Frederick the Great, and Jim the Great. With that, I hope you've enjoyed this piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church.